Let's talk about average cost. We're still talking about the short run, and so a firm still has fixed and variable cost, but they might be interested in what is their average cost. In fact, that is indeed how they will figure out what their profit is comparing the price that they receive to the average total cost of what they produce. So ATC, or average total cost, is simply total cost divided by the quantity of output. You can also look at average fixed cost and average variable cost. Those are important, not as important probably as average total cost. So average fixed cost, little typo there that I fixed, is fixed cost divided by quantity. You might be interested in average fixed cost if, say, you had built a factory and it cost $3 million and you're producing 400 units. You're wondering how your fixed costs are spread out amongst all of the production. And you might be interested in average variable cost because you are interested in thinking about, all right, how is my raw materials and my labor and my other variable costs, how are they spread across production? So those are the calculations, and now we want to predict the slope. But before we do that, we want to remember what's going on with marginal cost. Why is it upward sloping? Diminishing returns to inputs, or diminishing marginal product, another way of saying the same thing, reminds us that as output increases and we're adding more and more workers, for example, those workers at some point will start to get less and less productive as they get crowded, as there are limits to the number of machines each worker can use, etc. So we should expect that marginal cost is going to rise, and that means that total cost will be affected. So here's an opportunity for you to practice. Assume fixed costs are $100, regardless of the quantity of output. Fill in the following table. So go ahead and pause here and work on the problem. And when you're ready, let's solve it together. So here's key. It's $100 fixed cost. So we know that total cost, which are variable costs plus fixed cost, are going to be 120, 130, 146, and 180. Now average fixed cost, which is fixed cost over quantity. You're taking 100, dividing it through by quantity. Can't do that at 0 quantity. You can do that at quantity of 1. 100 over 1 is 100. 100 over 2 is 50. 100 over 3 is 33.3. And these are in dollars because they're costs. Now what about average variable cost? That is variable cost divided by quantity of output. Again, can't do that with a quantity of 0. We can do that with a quantity of 1. We can do that with a quantity of 2. And we can even do that with a quantity of 3. And last but not least, we can do average total cost. 2 different ways, as it turns out. Do you know what the second way is? So we can either do total cost divided by quantity, which is more dividing, but we're looking at this column, dividing it through by this column. So can't do that over 0. We can do it over 1, 130 over 1, 146 over 2, or we can just add average variable or average fixed and average variable cost together. Notice that if we do that, 100 plus 30, we get 130. 50 plus 23, 73. So choose your favorite way to calculate total cost over quantity, or add up average variable and average fixed. Here's another practice question of a different sort. You're being given some info and you're being asked to decide which you need. So what's the info that we have? We've got labor is $100 per worker per week, and the price of capital is $10 per unit. What is the fixed cost of production? So fixed cost of production is, we're not going to care about labor. We're only going to care about capital. And we know the quantity of capital is 10, and it's $10 each. So the answer should be 100. And that's not going to change. That's the nature of fixed inputs. Here is another question for you. This one's a little bit more in depth. The price of labor is $100 per worker per week, and the price of capital, $10 per unit, just like the last question. What is the total cost of producing 700 units of output? You're looking at this level here. Go ahead and pause it and work the problem. Then we'll solve it together. So here's the calculations. I just took the quantity, the price times the quantity of both the fixed cost and then also the variable cost. We've also defined that A is true theoretically, right? Your total cost divided by quantity is the same as your variable plus fixed cost over quantity, or chopping them into little pieces. They still work. What about B? Well, we almost have an answer for B. I've calculated the fixed cost by looking at the price times quantity, and I've looked at the variable cost by looking at price times quantity. Now we just need to add them together. And we just need to add the fixed cost to the variable cost to get our total cost. And B is not correct. And C is also not correct, because the total cost of producing 600 units is $60,100, and the total cost of producing 700 units is more, $70,100. So that also makes C a junk answer. A is correct. So there's an interesting thing about the shape of average total cost. Average total cost curve is affected by everything going on with total cost, which means it's affected by what's going on with the marginal cost. But also, it's affected by the spreading out of fixed cost over larger and larger quantities. So both of those together make it so that sometimes average cost is dropping as quantity is rising, and sometimes it's going the opposite direction. So the spreading effect relates to that fixed cost being spread out over more and more output. That tends to push down your average total cost, because it pushes down your average fixed cost. And then the second thing is that after a period, the diminishing returns effect, or diminishing marginal product effect, that we understand to be that as you add more and more variable inputs, after a point, the additional output begins to drop. That means we're going to have to start getting more inputs in if we want to eke out additional outputs, because those inputs are getting less productive, which means we're going to have to pay more to get those inputs. It's like this: adding more bags of fertilizer to your tomato plant, those are going to eventually yield less and less additional tomatoes after a time. And so if you want to keep increasing your tomato yield, be careful not to burn it with fertilizer. But if you want to add fertilizer, you can get more tomatoes, but it's going to cost you more and more to get each tomato once the bags of fertilizer become less productive. So generally speaking, we think we're going to see patterns like this, where average fixed cost is going to always drop, but average total cost will be U-shaped, as will average variable cost, because of the impact of the spreading effect and then the diminishing returns or diminishing marginal product effect, where marginal cost rises after some point. And here's some data, and then we'll show you the graph. So here's what we expect most firms' average total cost curves to look like. And there you have it, some stuff you need to know about average cost. Enjoy the day. Today is going to be a blue sun.